Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Reports emerging today that Red Bull's RB20 has failed its first round of crash tests with the FIA. The homologation of the frontal part is not yet complete. Changes will be required to the RB20 going forwards. Not something though Red Bull are strangers to. They've done this plenty of times over the years, pushing the absolute extremes on what is possible, but nonetheless this will delay their progress somewhat. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. Firstly, Alfa Romeo F1 Team Stake Sauber F1 Kick, whatever it's going to be called, is revealing their new team name relatively shortly. They do this post. I honestly can't be bothered with these guys' social media accounts. It really annoys me for some reason. But here we go. What is Alfa Romeo F1 Team Stake's new team name? Announcement soon. So, you know, they kind of heard about it, what it was going to be when the FIA released their team names a couple of weeks back now. But apparently that's not the end of the story here. They're making further adjustments to their team name. Mainly, I would imagine, based on the poor feedback that it got after the FIA did the official announcement, but changes coming soon, probably in the early part of next year, but definitely Sauber are hinting at what their new team is going to be. Speaking of that Sauber project, of course, Bottas over there at the moment, he's definitely implied that he wants to be part of Audi's 2026 plans. Lots of talk on which drivers they might get. Carlos Sainz will definitely be on the radar given his father's association with Audi. So will a German driver somewhere. Big rumours at the moment that Nico Hülkenberg is in consideration. There's been talk about Mick Schumacher. There's even been talk about Sebastian Vettel, right, bringing him out of retirement to come and drive for Audi's project from 2026. But I think Bottas will have to do more to prove that he is, well, deserving of a seat in that project. He hasn't exactly battered Zhou over the last couple of years. And, okay, in the last half of the season, he did well with respect to Zhou, but the car was terrible. So what can you really say? Also, some rumours going around about the Red Bull and exactly what the other teams are going to do next year. We're expecting many cars on next year's grid to look somewhat like the Red Bull. I mean, look, we've got to expect it at this point. We're here a couple of years into the regulations. The Red Bull have dominated effectively both of them. So look, sure, many cars will look similar, but it is the belief that in general, the concept that Red Bull have had is not necessarily that close to its ceiling. Horner has said, well, you know, we're seeing some diminishing returns. But the belief of the engineers seems to be that that Red Bull concept was not, okay, fantastic, absolute all-rounder, good in every condition, every track corner, everything, like basically a perfect car. But they believe they can go further, and other teams also believe that there are other innovations they can introduce to unlock even more potential. So most teams will retain some of their own ideas. Ferrari have said that next year's car is going to be, you know, a step on from this year's SF23 in certain ways, but I'm sure that mainly they'll be taking ideas from the Red Bull concept. We know full well that in terms of suspension setup and stuff, the Red Bull and the McLaren really towards the end of the season were the two cars that most closely aligned on that aspect, and it's probably no surprise that those two teams had the most, well, competitive second half of the seasons out of all the teams. But speaking of the Red Bull, this was one of the big stories of the day on the Red Bull RB20 frontal crash test failure. So this is coming out of the Italian media, and we've got to say, first of all, before we get into this, the Italian media reports on this basically every year with Red Bull and sometimes other teams as well, but they're very hot on the idea that teams are failing the crash test, which, you know, it's an important story and it's interesting nonetheless. Of course, Red Bull will succeed through the crash tests. They will just add more weight, add more protection. We'll get into that in a second. But the Italian media always report on this. It's been a topic for the last several years. But the idea that it's happening again this year is nonetheless worthy of discussion. Whether this is actually true, you've also got to weigh that observation because, you know, like, it's the Italian media, you guys know how it goes, and we'll see some examples of that too in a second. But this is what the article says. The translation here from the original Italian is changing the tenses around somewhat because, you know, what they're really saying here is this has now been done rather than would have, you know, been subjected to or whatever. But yeah, as they go on to say in the article, that the homologation test has gone through and the damage was not adequately absorbed. Well, basically the chassis did not adequately absorb the energy required, causing damage to the body of the car. So Milton Keynes, they have worked to lighten the RB20 and bring it to the weight limit. The test will then be repeated with an additional carbon skin, but the closure of the factories means that the timing, of course, is not ideal at the moment, given it's Christmas, New Year's, all this type of stuff. So this is what the article goes on to say. The first real rumours of any sort around the RB20 for next season. So as it goes on to say, Red Bull therefore did not obtain the homologation sticker from the International Federation, which was destroyed destroyed before Christmas in a crash test which took place in Cranfield, where all the British teams subject their new cars to the dynamic load tests. So the FIA, they have severe restrictions, of course, nowadays on the safety side of things. The cars have to hold up in certain ways. They have to be able to resist a certain amount of force in certain areas to ensure the driver is as safe as possible in impact situations. With sim, safety has come on leaps and bounds in Formula 1 over the last several decades, and nowadays the amount of crashes that seem incredibly dangerous and the driver just walks away, no harm done, is absolutely fantastic for the sport. There are still, though, certain situations where the cars probably need more work. For example, Zhou, his crash at Silverstone 2022, there was a failure of the roll bar or whatever it was above him in that scenario that, thankfully it was still okay. The halo kind of did its job, but one of the safety elements fails there. And also we've seen unfortunate fatalities over the last few years, not in Formula 1, but in other series, especially at Spa. And quite often what happens there is wet conditions, someone comes up, rally on, they spin the car, and then they get T-boned in the side. And it doesn't seem to me that the car at the side of the chassis, side of the cockpit, I suppose, is maybe adequately protected as it might be. Those are things that the FIA will have to look at, to work on, to try and increase the safety even further to what it presently is. But what they currently have in terms of crash testing is obviously pretty good because it's worked very well indeed. But there needs to be a certain amount of load that can be absorbed by the front of the car. Otherwise, the teams would just make their cars, unfortunately, it's just how it is, they'd make them as weak as possible if that was to benefit performance. And the drivers would probably agree in some part. That's just how, competitive these guys are. So I think it's good these crash tests exist. I think it's good that the safety's come on leaps and bounds as it has. But it also means that Red Bull and other teams will, they don't want to have any small element of safety over what is mandated because, that is the nature of sport. So as a result, the Red Bull has failed this test. They will have to add on further carbon layers in order to protect it, but that's going to add weight. And it's quite interesting that this has happened in the sense that if they were already at the weight limit, they would have proposed a chassis to the testing that they knew was going to be okay. They've clearly proposed a chassis here to the FIA for testing that they were probably mostly sure that it wasn't going to be okay, but they thought, well, maybe it'll be fine, so we'll give it a go. The belief is, of course, they're going to announce the car roughly February the 10th, in and around that ballpark, as most teams do. But, it's possible, even as the article here mentions, that because of this failure, they might have to push it back somewhat. Now, Red Bull, as it goes on to say, is no stranger to these situations. They've always tried to push the extremes on this stuff, to have the lightest nose and chassis possible, and then, if necessary, adding an extra layer of carbon to comply with the safety limits and absorb the energy in the event of a violent frontal impact. So the rumour is, though, that last year's car was still not perfectly on the number, as it is said here. The world champion car was still above the 798 kilogram limit. So according to speculation, it is conceivable that to gain weight, which is really to lose weight, right, but to gain advantage in the weight category, the RB20 has a shorter and more hollowed out nose, given that last year's RB19 was still probably very marginally, but still potentially above the weight limit, which Adrian Newey aims to go below the limit, because ideally you make your car 790 or something, and then you can play around with 8 kilograms of ballast in the front, in the middle, in the rear, whatever's necessary for the car to perform better at that circuit. So, anything under the limit is great. Anything on the limit is absolutely fine. But apparently, even last year's RB19 was not at the limit, which means that Red Bull are not exactly struggling, I would say, to find the weight, but they're trying to find the weight reduction everywhere they possibly can. So the article goes on to say that obviously the World Championship team has already taken countermeasures, but the stop to activity risks have had repercussions on the approval of the car, given that chassis number 2 is going to go for homologation, and, potentially there could be some hope for other teams, cracks in the system directed by Pierre Vacher. But of course, I'm sure Red Bull are aware of this, and it's not the first time rumours emerged from, as it says in the article, I think it says from the Italian media, doesn't it? Yeah, a report from the Italian media. This came out in 29th of January 2022. So this was ahead of the RB18 when rumours were emerging again from the Italian press that a crash test failure had happened and therefore the RB18 was in some bit of a predicament. Red Bull said, no problem, we're going to get it sorted. But to be fair, they started out that season with a very overweight RB18. When they had the weight down to closer to the limit, then they frankly dominated the season. And I think the only reason really that the season was close for the first half was because the RB18 was just a bit more sluggish and slower in especially the slow corners than the Ferrari was at the time. Once Red Bull dialed some of the weight back, then they were fine. But they were pushing hard at the start in the development of the RB18 supposedly to find that weight everywhere they possibly could, and it's a similar story again. So whether any of the changes to the RB20, we believe that Newey has some ideas on how to improve and innovate further, and some of those, I think even on the floor design, there were rumours that they're kind of building it again from the ground up. It's not a brand new car, obviously. It's going to take many points and inspiration from last year's arguably most dominant Formula 1 car ever, but Newey believes they can do better, and maybe parts of the changes they've made have added some weight. So now they've got to compensate for that, but their first attempt with the FIA has not exactly gone to plan. But, you know, Red Bull are taking risks, they're developing aggressively, this is what they do. It shouldn't be a massive surprise. But I guess the hope for the other teams might be that, well, are they seeing diminishing returns to such an extent that they have to really try and push their luck on the safety aspect, on the homologation, on the weight of the chassis, of the protection on the chassis from the safety point of view, and now they're not finding those gains there, then it's going to make them struggle. I'm not so convinced personally, but we'll see how it develops going forwards, I suppose. Of course, Mercedes are going to try and do a similar thing. Of course, other teams fail crash tests and stuff like this, but some teams are more aggressive than others on the way they make this work. Toto Wolff said a fair bit about loads of good things in the pipeline for next season's car, some of the optimism around it, and Toto Wolff saying that, look, we're not just going to give up on the next couple of years, we're focused on 2024, 2025, and then also 2026, right? So I don't want to give up on the recovery, he says, and say, let's just wait for 2026, new car, new engine. There's still 2 more important years to go, and also clarifying that from his perspective, it's very much about competing for championships again. But of course, there's talk, and then there's actual performance on the track. Couple of interesting things to mention for you guys before we close out the video. This was put together, the drivers did their own rankings of where they think the driver should be. Now, the only person who didn't vote in this, I believe, is Hamilton. Hamilton never gets involved in this stuff. I don't think he did the secret Santa either. You know, people always comment on, oh, like, yeah, ego and all this stuff. But I don't know the reasons behind it. I don't really think it matters at the end of the day. But all the drivers, except Hamilton, ranked, I suppose. Maybe they ranked themselves as well. I don't really know that one. But if you put that all together, you get the ranking as follows. There's some interesting ones in here, because we see when the media ranks drivers, when, you know, other people around the community rank drivers, and of the season they've just had, and there's always some debate on it. You know, Hamilton, Alonso, Norris, Leclerc, to me, were all between 2nd and 5th somewhere, but it's a matter of debate where you put them, I would say. Verstappen, of course, was clearly number 1. So this is what the drivers have said. Verstappen, Hamilton, Alonso, Norris, Leclerc. To be honest, the top 5, 6 is very similar, I think, to what I would have done. I think it's really 6 to 10 where I have some more questions, I would say. But the drivers agree, I would say, with the majority of fans on the way they've structured certainly the top 5. Albon, 7th, I think, is really cool to see him up here, because I think in general, any rankings you get, there will be car bias. There always is. I don't think you can escape it. But it's cool to see that Albon's getting credit here. The drivers have him 7th. That moves him up 2 places compared to how they ranked them last year. Alonso moves up 3 places, actually, with Leclerc coming down 3. So I guess Alonso was, 6th last year in the Alpine, despite the tricky season that he had. 2 new entries, though. Piastri here is number 8. And then Gasly. Good to see Gasly getting some respect, because I think he was really good this year, given the circumstances. I had him on the board as certainly of a top 10 driver. The drivers think he's 9th. What you will notice, though, is there's no Russell here, right? There's no Russell, which is interesting. I think that I would have had Russell in the top 10 somewhere. I think I wouldn't have had him particularly high into the top 10, but he would have been on my list. However, Perez gets on the list instead, which I've got to say is interesting, because, you know, Perez being number 10 here, given the fact that I actually agree with the top 5, but Perez at 10 is too high as far as I'm concerned. Race fans and others have ranked Perez at, like, you know, 20th, 21st, like 18th, you know, like a bad driver, which I think he was not good at all. I think it's difficult to justify 10th over, you know, Russell or Ocon or, you know, other drivers in that ballpark. Even Hülkenberg, like, Hülkenberg quite clearly outperformed Perez as far as I'm concerned this year. They had, you know, compare Q3 appearances, and it's very similar despite the car difference. So, I don't know. That's what the drivers have said. I actually quite like the top 9, but I think number 10, I would probably go for a different route. Then again, I'm sure drivers appreciate how difficult it can be to be in the second seat to Max Verstappen, especially at a team like Red Bull with, you know, the cars they produce tend to be, you know, we always talk about this. It's not like they're designed for Verstappen exactly, but Newey's cars historically work when you can absolutely extract the maximum, and if you cannot on that particular setup, you're going to struggle somewhat. But whatever you guys think about that, Verstappen's going to stay around. Who should his teammate be in 2025? There was some voting done here on Twitter as well. Perez gets the least votes of anybody. Ricciardo gets the most votes. Then Lawson, then Tsunoda. Very interesting to me that Lawson has more votes here than Yuki does. If you want to just choose from these four, between the Red Bull program, I think Ricciardo's probably going to get the nod, to be honest. But I'm not sure that will be the case, or I'm not sure that necessarily should be the case. I know people are also wondering what's going to happen with Hamilton. Like, let's say Hamilton does 3 more years and retires. To be honest, like, if Hamilton's going to make it until the end of 2025, he might as well stay for 1 year of the new regulations, unless he's just washed by then, which I don't think he will be. But if his performance falls off, maybe he's just going to call it a day. But when Hamilton does decide to step away eventually, who's going to replace him? Could it be Leclerc? Could it be Norris? Like, could it be Antonelli, right? And then maybe Russell steps up to the primary seat, I guess, at Mercedes. We'll see what their plan is. But it also means that Leclerc, or certainly Norris, could be available over the coming years for the Red Bull seat as well. So I'm not sure it's quite as clear-cut as just looking at the Red Bull drivers. I think they will have more interest for sure for that seat than is currently being, well, maybe put across. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.